Hi, I'm Sophia State, and this is The Absolute State of the Research. Today, I'm talking about a term that I've coined the Elegiac Undead, and I'm talking about this term in the context of fairy tales and of superheroes. Fairy tales are at their core about hope, and hope is never a singular, simple thing. So it's not surprising that fairy tales have a long and storied history, pun very much intended. Perrault's tales, which are the fairy tales that most people probably think of, Cinderella, for example, were crafted from older folk tales for a very specific educational purpose, to instill the civility required for the Enlightenment project. The Romantics then used fairy tales to challenge the excesses of rationalisation or rationalism and modernisation, using the tales to point towards alternative values. To quote Terry Pratchett's misquotation of Chesterton, children have always known there are dragons. Fairy stories tell children that dragons can be killed. Although there have been many different dragons and hope has assumed many different forms over the centuries, my contention is that something significant happened in 1937. Hope died. A number of other significant things happened in 1937. The Hindenburg exploded, Amelia Earhart disappeared, the Chicago police faced no repercussions for their massacre of unarmed protesters, the Imperial Japanese Army captured Shanghai, and Disney's feature-length animated film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Tolkien's The Hobbit changed the relationship between fairy tales and popular culture forever. Now, just 6 months after Snow White debuted, signalling the beginning of the subsumation of fairy tales into what's been called princess culture, Superman then became the mirror image in boys' culture. This three-way fracturing of fairy tales into happily ever after heterosexual rescue fantasy in princess culture, and a violent domination fantasy in superheroes, and then the wondrous other worlds fantasy of what's now called high fantasy or just fantasy fiction, continues to dominate the commercial categories of childhood imaginations today. And I'm only going to focus on superheroes and princesses, but there is a lot also to be said about high fantasy. Now, when I say that Snow White and Superman signal the death of hope, I don't mean that all hope immediately faded from the world and that no one ever experienced any form of hopeful emotion again. But what I'm arguing is that the dragons in these stories can no longer be convincingly killed. That kernel of hope that our own actions and choices can determine our path joined the ranks of the elegiac undead. And in the century since, many Disneyized fairy tales and superhero stories have concluded with happy endings, but those happy endings, I think, have become increasingly unconvincing. Although I don't engage substantially in Ulrich Beck's ideas in this particular talk, my starting point in conceptualizing the elegiac undead is his notion of the zombie category. And simply put, a zombie category, it's a category that is emptied of meaning, but that continues to shamble through our societies and our institutions. So, for example, the majority of families are not comprised of a married heterosexual couple and their exclusively shared biological children. But this zombie category of a heteronormative procreative family continues to dominate institutional and political responses to the idea of family. So, extending the logic of this metaphor beyond anything that Beck himself ever argued, what strikes me is that the zombie is abhorrent because it's dead, but it refuses to behave as though dead. It moves when it should be still. It hungers when it should be at peace. And the resolution, in the flesh notwithstanding, to a zombie is to emphatically and irreparably enforce a permanent death. The reason that I am introducing this new term, the elegiac undead, rather than simply extending zombie categories into the realm of storytelling, is that dealing a death blow to the elegiac undead would not provide a resolution. The elegiac undead are an entirely different sort of beast. They are ideas, ideals, or hopes even, which are dead, gone, unrevivable, but to which we cling and refuse to let go, because to admit to their death would involve confronting truths that are unbearable. The future is one such idea, and despite our rational understanding of the climate catastrophe and numerous other disasters unfolding with no convincing path to resolution, we continue to birth children, to put away savings for retirement. And retirement too is a member of the Elegiac Undead increasingly, certainly for my generation. So back to Snow White and Superman. The witch in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is killed by lightning, and Snow White is inexplicably brought back to life by a kiss. Her happily ever after is achieved by Deus Ex Machina. Superman expresses a similar fantasy in the sense that a godlike hero comes to Earth from elsewhere and fixes all the messes made by humans. In 1937, as the Spanish Civil War raged and fascist Japan and fascist Germany were negotiating their formal alliance, the desire to imagine a happy future was strong, but the only way to vivify the cadaver of hope was through outside intervention by powerful and supernatural forces. When dealing with a corpse, of course, the passing of time is an issue of great importance. The superheroes in their earliest iterations attempted to escape time through the resistance of narrative foreclosure. And as Umberto Eco wrote in 1972, the authors of Superman used numerous ploys to avoid dealing with any passing of time at all, including alternative realities, dreams, and constant retellings of past events. And he concluded, quote, "In this massive bombardment of events which are no longer tied together by any strand of logic, whose interaction is ruled no longer by any necessity, the reader, without realizing it, of course, loses the notion of temporal progress," end quote. In both superhero and fairy tale stories, we have obsessed ourselves with origin stories and prequels, and we've remade them over and over to avoid facing the other end of the narrative arc. Logan is a powerful exception to this observation. In Snow White and subsequent Disney fairy tales, time is sped up, with the narrative an unstoppable rush to escaping girlhood and achieving happily ever after through hastened heterosexual initiation. The difficulty of convincingly presenting the idea that partnership with men is a positive outcome for women is evident in the 30-year hiatus in Disney's fairy tale romance films between the late 50s and the 80s. When Disney did unearth, dust off, and successfully disguise with tiaras and tulle this particular corpse, it was in the family values political era of the 1990s. I think The Little Mermaid was 1989, but we'll just say 90s. Notably, however, the prince as rescuer and as path toward upward mobility has decayed odorously in these versions. The 1990s Disney princesses were learning to please patriarchal beasts. Ariel's father forces her to perform songs about how great he is. Sacrificing her voice and throwing herself on the mercy of a strange man seems less romantic than a desperate escape. Belle is groomed to accept the violent rages and moodiness of her captor lover, while Pocahontas' abduction is similarly recast as a love story. Jasmine is Aladdin's saviour and path to financial security, not the other way around, and she remains just as trapped in the palace at the end of the film as she was at its beginning. The new millennium has seen a surge of remakes, reboots, and reimaginings of fairy tales and superhero stories, of course. And there was a particularly intense period of both dark fairy tale and gritty superhero film releases from 2008 to 2018, including The Dark Knight in 2008, Red Riding Hood in 2011, The Dark Knight Rises 2012, Snow White and the Huntsman 2012, Man of Steel 2013, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters 2013, Maleficent in 2014, The Huntsman 2016, Suicide Squad 2016, Logan 2017, excuse me, and so on. Even the Power Rangers got a dark and gritty makeover for their 2017 film. These dark reimaginings reveal a subconscious awareness that these genres are vehicles of a hope that is long dead, despite our refusal to unclench the grip of our imaginations on the corpse. This 10-year period saw the global financial crisis and lack of any meaningful change in its wake, despite the intensity of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It saw the hope of the Arab Spring dashed into death and destruction. It saw the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum. Hope, even in the form of alien intervention or deus ex machina, could not be expressed unironically in this period. Jack Zipes writes that, quote, "This power of fantasy is propelled by imaginings of changed circumstances and conditions," end quote. And we've been clearly shown that we are powerless, that no one is coming to save us. There will be no change, at least no change for the better in our circumstances. And yet we're unwilling to let go of hope, insisting, Monty Python-like, that it's not dead, it's just resting. One of the typical human responses to despairing situations, Curry and Belafke write, is violence. It is also typical in such situations to dream of violence. And we suspect that it is this dream of a violent solution to despair that we are seeing in the modern superhero stories, end quote. Returning now to the distinction between zombies and the elegiac undead, I want to think for a moment about how zombie narratives end. As Tara Brabazon points out, zombie narratives have one of two endings. Either all zombies are killed or all humans are killed. And she says, quote, "These binaries are punctuated by a perpetual displacement of this ending," end quote. However, she continues, and to quote again, "Linear time is no longer a guide through the zombie apocalypse. The past, present, and future all live, breathe, walk, eat, and kill," end quote. I think there are more options for approaching the elegiac undead than there are for zombies, but the issue of time remains a difficult one. Both past and future are tangled into the present of mourning and of denial. Popular culture has engaged thoughtfully with its reliance on the elegiac undead for some time, perhaps most explicitly in WandaVision. WandaVision uses the elegiac undead figure of the superhero to tell a story that is also about the elegiac undead. Spoilers from here on in. If you haven't yet seen the show, stop watching now. Unable to let go of her hopes and dreams for a future with Vision, Wanda enslaves an entire town to serve as the backdrop for her romance with Vision, who she's animated using his elegiac undead body to impregnate herself, resulting in a family structure which, without wanting to get too meta here, I note represents the zombie category that Beck devoted particular attention to. Wanda is ultimately unable to sustain her necromancy of hope, seeing intrusive flashes of Vision's lifeless, mutilated body overlaying the one that she has animated. The story seems to end with Wanda accepting her bereavement, lifting the enchantment that is giving life to her family and thus consigning them to oblivion. However, this only happens after Vision's actual corpse has been reanimated by Sword and granted access to his memories by the vision of Wanda's creation. Furthermore, the post-credits scene shows Wanda hearing her children calling to her, presumably from an alternate timeline to be explored in a subsequent story. Thus, her acceptance of loss comes to seem less than final. Instead, she seems to be searching for a more powerful vehicle for the reanimation of her dead dreams. So why does this matter? How is the elegiac undead a useful term? I propose that the usefulness of identifying and naming the elegiac undead is that it empowers us to let them go, to stop stuffing the corpse of hope into a tiara and a ball gown, to get Salvation's skeleton out of the spandex and lay them to rest in the ruins of the enchanted forest. It seems to me that the solution to the elegiac undead, with a nod to Donna Haraway, is to allow hope to become humus and corpse to become compost. Only then will we discover what delicate fungi and new narrative forms may be nourished by them. Thanks for listening.